I want to bring in Stuart Stevens, senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, chief strategist for Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign, and author of the book, It Was All a Lie. Eli Stokols is White House and Foreign Affairs correspondent for Politico, and Lisa Rubin is MS Now's senior legal reporter. Stuart, that testimony from Ruby Freeman was searing. It's something you can't get out of your head. And now the federal government is asking for names, residential and email addresses, phone numbers. If they get that, what's to stop the president or anyone else from using it to target these workers as Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss lived through?
Well, nothing's there to stop them. That's what they're going to do. That's why they're trying to do it. Look, this is another case where Republicans are to blame. And any Republican who doesn't think that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020, who was elected in that same election, should resign. It doesn't work this way. You don't have a ballot where like half the ballot is good and the other half isn't good. I think the challenge for Democrats here is those of us that believe in democracy, and I spent years pointing out flaws in the Democratic Party, but it's now the only pro-democracy party in America, is they do something outrageous like this. We go, no, you can't do this. But what is the offense? And I really think that's something that those of us who support democracy and largely going to be Democrats need to be thinking about, because they go in, like Todd Blanche will go in and do this stuff, absolutely convinced that there'll be nothing that will come back that will haunt him. And I think that's dangerous. And I think there really needs to be a sense, in the same way lawyers are sometimes held responsible for filing false legal claims and are sanctioned. There needs to be a lot of thought about how to go on the offense against those who are doing this inside the government.
And Eli, the chair of the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, talked about the other potential impact of this. He called it outrageous federal overreach designed to intimidate and chill participation in elections. Do you see a potential ripple effect that could impact who actually decides to go and vote?
Sure. I mean, I think people who study elections, would say that this can have a chilling effect. It can convince election workers, people not to volunteer to help run the elections. And it can convince, some voters to stay home. I think it can also backfire. It can embolden voters who might sit this out to take offense and to say, no, I'm going to make sure I'm going to stand in that line. I'm going to get my vote counted. We don't know exactly how this will play out this November, but I think it's obvious that the midterms being 6 months away, that is clearly increasingly top of mind inside the White House and for Republicans. And so they're looking for avenues to tilt those midterms in their favor. I think the other thing that you can't underestimate in terms of the context and why this is happening now, Stuart mentioned Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general. One of the reasons Pam Bondi was fired by the president, I'm told by senior White House officials, was that the president felt that she wasn't doing enough. There wasn't enough action on things that matter to the president. We all know the president makes it obvious that he's never going to get over the 2020 election and the Georgia results in particular. And so this is an attorney general who is in an interim role trying to satisfy the boss with action, with the action that the president wants to see. That's obviously completely antithetical to the history of the Justice Department being an independent federal agency, but that's where we are. And I think that's a big reason why you're seeing what you're seeing right now.
And Stuart, given what Eli just said, is it nevertheless not so much about changing the 2020 election, but you spread enough doubt, you spread enough confusion that then the Trump administration can challenge whatever results they don't like in 2026 or 2028?
Yeah, look, since Trump was elected, when he first announced, there has been a systematic effort to undermine the pillars of civil society. They go after the legal system. They go after law enforcement. They go after the military. They go after education. They go after science. These are what makes a country powerful. And their goal is to weaken America, because I think these people really are at war with what it means to be an American. So, Eli makes a really good point. There's a law of unintended consequences that kicks in politics often. And there's this question here. If you go back to that extraordinary moment when 2 Democrats were elected to the Senate in Georgia on January 5th, 2021. I mean, you have to have worked in the South really to understand just how remarkable. It's like winning the World Series in 4 perfect games. And one of the reasons they won is that Trump discouraged people from voting by saying it was all rigged. And, you know, I think Democrats should do that. Look, if you're a Republican, you think it's rigged, don't bother. Don't vote.
So, Lisa, I go back to the basic of legally speaking. What is the point here? I mean, the Georgia County Board says even if they find evidence of wrongdoing in 2020, and we'll say again, time and time and time again, it's been tried and failed. But even if they did, isn't the statute of limitations up?
Certainly with respect to the 2 statutes that they listed in a search warrant application for some of the voting data several months ago that they got from the Fulton County, I believe the clerk of court where those records were kept, that certainly is an argument worth making and probably a very good argument. But this appears to be a grand jury subpoena in search of a crime rather than having a criminal theory where you're looking for evidence to support something that you already have substantiated. It's almost as if Todd Blanche has deputized somebody from the Middle District of North Carolina who does not practice law in the Northern District of Georgia. I should remind you, it appears as if this particular U.S. attorney has been deputized to helm a bunch of election-related probes and then try to sort of reverse engineer a criminal prosecution theory as opposed to having a theory of laws that have already been violated. And of course, there's the other aspect of this that Stuart and Eli have emphasized. The way in which the subpoena is written, it doesn't just ask for the names and addresses and information of election workers. It asks for them by sort of minute categories of who worked on what particular tasks. That suggests to me that they are trying to figure out whether or not from the county data they can find a legal violation and then tether that to who was responsible for example, manning mobile voter stations or who worked at particular polling station X or Y. That's a very, very dangerous proposition, Chris.
But if I go back to Ruby Freeman, I mean, what does that do to the average election worker who already, if you're working in a busy place, and even if you're not, the stress that you can feel just because of what's at stake, if you add on this kind of pressure, like if I so much as blink, I could be in trouble. What does that do?
I mean, you have to imagine that the ability of Fulton County to recruit election workers, both permanent and temporary, in the wake of what happened to Ruby Freeman and her daughter has already been diminished substantially. This is a woman who, between she and her daughter, were passing ginger mints and were accused essentially of trying to throw the entire 2020 presidential election in Georgia. I just want to remind our viewers of what the accusation was. Now, on top of that, to see the Department of Justice seek the names of what could be 3,000 people who worked in the 2020 election, I can't imagine that there is much incentive for anyone to serve as an election worker who doesn't already work in that capacity on a full-time basis. And undermining the conduct of our midterm elections, that is part of the design here. It's not just to criminally enforce the laws. It is also to provide an incentive for these elections not to be full and fair and robust under the federal laws as they exist.